Welcome to an O'Connor Institute Issues and Answers discussion with George W. Hammond. I'm Liam Julian with Civics for Life. Professor George W. Hammond directs the Economic and Business Research Center in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona, a specialist in econometric forecasting for more than 2 decades. Hammond has designed, built, and used economic models to produce more than 100 forecasts for state and local economies and completed more than 50 regional economic studies on topics including economic and workforce development, energy forecasting, and the impact of higher education on human capital accumulation. Professor Hammond, thanks a lot for being here.
Oh, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So, the economic story in the news, of course, for the past 2 years has been inflation, frequently portrayed or presented at least as a national story. But I'd like to talk a little bit, if we could, about the regional variances that we see in inflation. Phoenix, of course, made the news last year. Phoenix metro area is having the highest rate of inflation in the country. So I thought maybe we could start. You could tell us a little bit about that. Why are we seeing these different rates of inflation in different parts of the country, and what does that mean?
Sure. Well, inflation is a process driven primarily by larger macroeconomic forces like monetary and fiscal policy, supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, and gas prices. But though all of those factors can have different impacts across the various regions of the country, depending on the kind of the structure and the makeup of those regions. So, what we've seen here in Phoenix and Arizona more broadly, we actually only have data for Phoenix, but I think it's a broader phenomenon than just Phoenix, is that inflation during the past couple of years has been locally running much hotter than we've seen nationally. And what's driving that is kind of the different characteristic of the Arizona economy. So, according to the latest data for Phoenix, which is February, for Phoenix we get data every other month. But in February of this year, over the year, Phoenix inflation was 8.5% compared to 6% for the nation. And that's actually, Phoenix is a little bit closer to the US than it was, say, last summer. Phoenix's inflation rate, again, over the year, reached its peak of 13% last summer compared to about 9% for the US. So inflation has come down a little bit nationally and here in Phoenix, but in Phoenix, and I think more broadly for Arizona, we are still experiencing much faster rates of price increase than we're seeing on average for the nation.
Yeah. Well, let's dig down into that a little bit. So when we're talking about these rates of inflation, we're talking about the consumer price index, right? CPI. Is that generally what's being used? And if I'm correct, CPI, of course, measures many different things, cost increases in different areas. Housing is a huge part of it. I believe housing is something of a third. Is that accurate of CPI? So my
Yes.
Okay.
Sure. The consumer price index is one of the most popular measures. There is another measure which uses the same underlying data, but it gets massaged and put together in a slightly different way, which is the personal consumption expenditures deflator. And that's actually the measure that the Federal Reserve relies on in setting monetary policy. But they both use the same essentially input data. And the consumer price index actually gets quite a bit more attention than does the personal consumption expenditures deflator used by the Fed. So when you're thinking about the consumer price index, the all items index is actually a weighted average of price changes for goods and services that you and I buy as part of our daily lives. So if you think about what you purchase as part of your your daily life over a given year. That's pretty much representative of the items that are included in the consumer price index. So the thing to keep in mind is it's a weighted average, and the weights are determined by a nationally representative survey of consumers and what they tend to spend their money on.
Hmm.
And we buy gas, we buy food, appliances, furniture, healthcare, recreational services, educational services. But you're right. One of the biggest service categories that we all spend money on is housing services. So, housing includes everything that you spend as part of keeping a roof over your head. So that includes rent. There's an owner-occupied version of rent. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which puts together the data, actually tries to estimate what it would cost for a homeowner to rent their home to themselves, so that we have comparable data for homeowners and renters. It also includes, insurance, utilities, all that stuff, insurance, all that stuff that we spend
Right.
as part of keeping a house over our head. And for the all items index, that accounts for about a third. If we look at core,
Yeah.
what we call core inflation, which excludes food and energy, it's about 40%
Right.
of that index.
So the question arises, right? To what extent, when you're looking at a news report that tells you, for example, that Phoenix's inflation is vastly higher, what you had said earlier, 2.5 percentage points higher than inflation in the country nationally, to what extent are we seeing data that are actually quite skewed by the fact that housing in Phoenix has gotten so incredibly expensive? I mean, is it the case? eh, Well, you tell me.
Yes. The what's driving the difference between Phoenix inflation and national inflation is what's going on in the housing market.
Okay.
If we look at consumer purchases of commodities, so that would include things like automobiles, gasoline, food, appliances, furniture, all those tangible things that we buy as part of our daily lives. Phoenix's inflation rate is very close to the national average. Where the big difference is in the services component, and services is really dominated by housing. Just to give you a feel for it, over the year in February, the shelter component of the consumer price index in Phoenix rose just over 16%, and that was roughly double the national average. So it's really what's going on in the housing market that's driving that difference between Phoenix and the US.
Interesting. Yeah, and I suppose there's sort of the other question too is just as you read a news report and perhaps the report is overstating inflation in a place like Phoenix, it may be quite the case, right? That inflation, people do not realize that inflation is actually quite high in places like, I don't know, Boston or San Francisco, places where housing is not, in fact, the housing costs are not increasing. Is that accurate?
Sure, the markets across the US that are experiencing really, or that experienced last summer, these really rapid increases in home prices. Here in Arizona, Phoenix and Tucson, we were seeing, 20, 30% over the year gains in house prices. And those are huge. And that really drove the shelter consumer price index up. At its peak, it rose 19% over the year here in Phoenix. So it's come down a little bit as we've seen house prices come down. In Phoenix, home prices measured by the median house price, they're down about between 14 and 15% from their peak. Tucson home prices are down, but a little bit less, maybe 4 to 5% from their peak last summer. So anywhere where house prices across the nation were really ramping up as they were here in Arizona, you would have seen that reflected in what was going on with overall inflation.
Hmm. So it's it's sort of widely understood, I believe, that inflation has much more of a felt effect on people in lower socioeconomic categories. Is that correct? Would you say? Um,
Yes.
it,
So, keep in mind that the consumer price index is meant to reflect the experience of sort of an average consumer. But,
okay,
most of us are not average, right?
right,
So,
sure,
if you're not buying a car and you're not buying a house, you didn't experience the same sort of hit to real income or inflation adjusted income that
yeah,
people who had to buy a car, had to buy a house, had to buy gas, had to buy food from the same store we're experiencing. So one of the reasons that economists believe that rapidly rising prices have a bigger negative impact on low income individuals than high income individuals is because low income people tend to have fewer options for substituting away from goods and services whose prices are rising. Right.
right,
So a low income person may already be shopping at, Walmart or kind of the lowest end grocery stores. They tend to, have to drive to work, whereas, higher income individuals, maybe they're shopping at Whole Foods and they can substitute down to shopping at Walmart, buying off brands,
yeah.
maybe working from home more than they were before gas prices started to rise. So it, at least the evidence that I've seen suggests that low income households are more negatively affected by rapidly rising prices than our higher income households. But to some extent, it affects everyone.
Well, my question then related to that is, when you have a situation like in Phoenix, for example, where the inflation that we see is being driven to such a degree by housing, does this even more impact people in lower socioeconomic categories because those people have to rent? Uh, Whereas people, you would assume people in higher socioeconomic categories perhaps had locked in a mortgage when a mortgage rate was low, so they had a steady sort of house payment. Are those variations in housing costs much more sort of born? And then the broader question being, I know I'm asking a lot of questions. The broader question being then, are there certain types of inflation that are just more painful for certain types of people?
Sure, low income households are more likely to be renters, and we have seen, rent increases be an important part of what we see going on in the consumer price index for shelter. So that certainly is a big part of it.
Mhm.
Individuals who own their houses typically, if they own it outright or have a fixed rate mortgage, there's not much change or no change in that mortgage payment, so they're somewhat insulated from the increase in home prices until they or unless they need to sell a home and move somewhere else. So yes, that's absolutely another dimension. And the factors driving inflation, any particular inflation, is driven by somewhat unique combinations of characteristics. But the exact factors driving inflation can absolutely change the degree to which it impacts various socioeconomic groups.
How are you seeing as we mentioned in your introduction, you do a lot of economic forecasting for cities, for regions. How are you seeing the inflation that's playing out in Arizona as affecting economic development? I suppose also not just the inflation itself, but the the interest rate rises that have happened because of it. How do you see that playing out? And maybe you could also tell us, what do you see 3, 6 months, a year ahead?
Sure. We do see inflation having impacts. So if we, adjust income for inflation in 2022, real income actually declined, partly because of rapidly rising prices, but also partly because the huge amount of federal income support related to the pandemic essentially ended in 2021. So we got a major drop off in income growth in 2022. But rising prices also contributed to that. And those rising prices are beginning to contribute to slower growth in, retail sales and other factors. The rising House prices had a huge negative impact on housing affordability here in Arizona. So, one of the measures that we track in my center is the Housing Opportunity Index from the National Association of Home Builders and Wells Fargo. And what we saw at that index, what that tells you is the share of homes sold during a given period of time that were affordable to a family making the median income. In the fourth quarter of 2022, only 18% of homes sold in Phoenix were affordable to a family making the median. And that was down from, around 64, 65% before the pandemic began. And we're seeing something similar, although not quite as severe in Tucson. And again, something similar, but not quite as severe on average for the nation. So, that big run up in house prices had a huge impact on housing affordability. And that increase in housing and decrease in housing affordability contributed to the decline in house prices that we've seen, as did the increase in mortgage interest rates, which, roughly doubled as we went through 2022.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see going forward? We're sort of at a moment now where economists have been disagreeing for a while about inflation, and we're sort of at another moment, I think, where there's some disagreement among economists of where we're going from here. Where do you see us going? And maybe you can offer that regional perspective on Arizona.
Yes, I think inflation nationally and in Arizona is going to continue to drop as we go through the next year or so. I think it's going to be a slow process, a slow, gradual process of getting back to the Federal Reserve's target nationally of 2% over the year. We're probably looking at, sometime in 2024, maybe the second half of 2024 before we reach that. So, it's going to be a slow slog, and, unless the national economy falls into a really severe downturn. And I think most of us would probably prefer a nice steady deceleration, over the next year in house prices and no downturn nationally.
Right. And one of the big questions has been, with the rising interest rates as the Fed has continually hiked them, would the Fed push the economy into a recession? Of course, it's difficult to know that you're in a recession until a little while after you've been in one. So I guess my question here is, are there regional differences there as well? So, for example, as we're seeing regional differences in inflation around the country, could it in fact be the case that the economy in Arizona doesn't get pushed into that recession, whereas maybe the economy in another region of the country would be? And also, do you think that will happen?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve will do what it takes to get inflation down to its target over the next year or so. And that may involve a national downturn. The Fed does not have a good track record of bringing inflation down without causing a U.S. recession. And on that basis alone, the odds of a national downturn sometime late this year or in 2024 are and remain elevated. Now, Arizona is in much better shape going into this period of economic uncertainty compared to where we were in 2006 and 2007. So, my view is that if the national economy falls into a mild or moderate downturn, somewhere along the lines of what the nation went through in the early 1990s or early 2000s, that Arizona would come through that sort of national downturn in good shape. I don't think we would even experience negative job growth. I think we would significantly slow in terms of job growth, but we would come through that sort of national downturn in very good shape.
Mm-hmm. Last question is about that, actually, Professor Hammond, about the job growth. We recently got numbers from the Labor Department for April for jobs. Really strong jobs numbers, 253,000 added jobs. That may be revised down, but still came in pretty strong. It's the best gain since January. Unemployment's at 3.4% in the country right now, lowest reading since 1969. Wages are rising, 4.4% increase in April from a year ago. Is this national story also happening regionally in here in Arizona? Are we seeing those kind of numbers here as we are seeing them nationally?
Yes, absolutely. Arizona's labor market remains really dynamic.
Hmm.
We're adding jobs at a very solid pace. The unemployment rate is very low. It's very near the lowest levels we've seen going back to the 1970s, just as is the national economy. Arizona's labor market is really tight. So employers are really struggling to find the workers that they need, and workers have a lot of opportunities to pick and choose among jobs. And in that sort of market, you see rapid wage gains.
Right.
My favorite measure is the employment cost index. That's measured only for Phoenix here in Arizona, but there we're seeing even though it's come down a little bit at 4.4% in the fourth quarter. That's still some of the fastest growth we've seen in labor costs here in Phoenix since before the great financial crisis in 2007, 2009.
Right. I know, Professor Hammond, I said that was the last question. I lied. I have one more. With that type of strong job growth here in Arizona and those wage increases, how does inflation slow? What is the cause for starting to get inflation to come down when the job market remains so tight, people have more money in their wallets? What is going to stop consumers from paying higher prices? What's going to bring inflation down?
What will bring inflation down here in Arizona is a little bit of luck on the national and international level with gas prices coming down from their current levels. Excuse me. Commodity inflation here in Arizona and nationally is already down significantly as supply chains have loosened up internationally. House prices are falling here in Arizona, both in Phoenix and in Tucson. As those continue to moderate, perhaps don't continue to fall quite as much, but as those moderate, that will contribute as well. And I do think that even though the Arizona labor market is currently still really dynamic, I think it will slow as the national economy slows later this year and early next year, and that will take some of the pressure off wage growth, and that's where we'll really see inflation continue to decelerate.
Yeah, it's always interesting in these conversations, isn't it? Because it sometimes feels like you're rooting for things to happen that you don't want actually to be rooting for, right? Like we want inflation to come down, therefore we need people to earn less money. It's like it's a weird kind of dynamic sometimes when you're like, when are wages going to stop growing? But that's just part of it, I suppose, right?
Yeah, we want wages to be growing because the productivity of our workforce is increasing.
Right,
That's really what drives prosperity and true wealth accumulation.
right, right. Professor George Hammond, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us today. Give us the regional perspective on inflation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.